Welcome back. In this video, we're going to take a deeper look at some of the more advanced blocks in the block builder and explore some of the combinations you can use to get full control over market timing, trend identification, and risk management. These blocks are some of my own favourites, and I personally use a lot of these combinations in my own trading strategies. Once you understand the logic behind them, you'll unlock the power to build far more sophisticated trading strategies with the potential to generate some great returns. We're going to look at mixing different time frames, building real take profit and stop loss logic, creating smarter trailing stops, and adding cooling off periods to prevent compounding losses. And finally, we'll touch on how this ties into trading with leverage. Let's start with mixing time frames. This can be incredibly helpful when building trading strategies, especially when you only want to trade in the right market conditions. Longer time frames are great for identifying trends, and shorter time frames are perfect for timing your entries and exits. To walk through some examples, let's build a simple mean reversion strategy as we go. I'm starting with a blank scenario, and first I'm going to set up our entry rules. We want to make sure that we're in an uptrend, so let's use a 4-hour MACD. This will confirm that the broader trend is rising upwards. I'm then going to use a 5-minute RSI to determine the entry signal. So if we have an uptrend on the 4-hour chart and we're slightly oversold on the 5-minute chart, then that's when I'm going to enter. Now there's a small issue here to solve. The 5-minute data watcher triggers every 5 minutes, but the longer data watcher only updates every 4 hours. We want the strategy to be able to open a trade every 5 minutes, not wait for the end of each 4-hour candle. So we need to save the most recent output from the 4-hour condition as a variable. This is one of the most important uses of the variable block. It lets shorter time frame blocks update constantly while still using the last known value of the longer time frame signal. Variables are also incredibly helpful for reusing the same value in multiple places or keeping your strategy organized, but we'll cover those examples in a later video. Now let's add one more condition to our entry logic: on balance volume. OBV is a really powerful way of checking whether a move has real volume behind it. In our algo, you'll see two different versions of OBV, here in the indicator block and as an output from the data watcher. The indicator block calculates OBV from the moment your strategy starts running. The version in the data watcher, however, takes the entire OBV history from the exchange. Those numbers can be very different because the OBV is cumulative. If you look at OBV in TradingView, for example, it only accumulates within the visible window, which is not the true value, unless the chart starts from the very first candle in the asset's history. So in this example, I'm going to use the OBV from the data watcher. And all I'm doing is checking whether the 5-minute 3-candle moving average is above the 10-candle moving average. It's a simple confirmation that the volume is supporting the trade before we enter. And now we've got a clean multi-time frame entry. We've got a 4-hour trend confirmation, a 5-minute oversold signal, and a 5-minute volume confirmation. Now that we have all that, there's one more part I'd like to build in, and I put this into almost every strategy I use, and that's a cooling off period. You might have seen this in your own trading, but losses often come in clusters, and that usually happens because the market's choppy or because the strategy re-enters too quickly after a losing trade. The order history block solves this. It has two outputs: the number of hours since the last trade and the profit percentage of the last trade. I use both. First, I check that the last trade was more than either 4, 12 or 24 hours ago, depending on the type of strategy. Second, I check whether the last trade finished in profit. If either of those is true, then the strategy is allowed to open a new position. If not, we pause. This can dramatically reduce the risk of firing multiple losing trades in a row and compounding our losses. The block outputs the time in hours, and I'm feeding in a 5-minute data watcher. So every 5 minutes, it's going to trigger and check the previous 12 hours of trading history to make sure that we didn't just take a loss. With the entry logic complete, let's move to the exit rules. If the 4-hour trend reverses, then I want to get out of the trade. So I'm going to have a rule here looking at the opposite of the MACD entry rule. This just ensures we're not holding for a major downturn. Then we build a proper take profit condition using the last signal profit block. In this example, if the 5-minute RSI rises above 70 and the trade's already up more than 5%, then I want to take profit. This is a great example of using the last signal profit block for real exit conditions. Not just sell when the RSI is high, but sell when the RSI is high and you're actually in profit. It prevents premature exits. As well as a take profit, we can also use this last signal block for a stop loss. In this strategy, I've set it to close the trade if the last profit drops below 70%. Now this might sound like a lot, but since we're using leverage, this can protect us from liquidation. and it gives the trade a lot of room to breathe, but not too much. Obviously we'd like to close the trade before that, but this is our final backstop to prevent liquidation if everything else fails. If I wanted to make the stop loss smarter, I could combine this with other rules like we did for the take profit. Like the last profit is below 70, and we have a high level of volatility, or a volume confirmation. But we'll keep this straightforward for now. Now let's talk about some trailing stops. First I'm going to show you the most basic version, a trailing stop with a fixed distance. Here I'm monitoring the 5-minute price and simply selling if the price drops more than 1%. Simple, effective, easy to understand, but not really flexible for volatile markets. There are different ways to add that flexibility, and one way is to vary the stop distance with the volatility. For example here, I'm going to use the average true range, or ATR, as my measure of volatility. This means that the stop distance will naturally widen during fast markets and tighten during slow ones. First, I'm going to add the ATR block and feed in the high, low and closing prices. I'm then going to work out the ATR as a percentage of the overall price using this percentage block. I'm measuring the ATR on a 15-minute time frame and the stop is based on a 5-minute time frame. So I'm going to use a variable block to capture the stop distance every 15 minutes and then feed this into the trailing stop block. Sounds cleverer than a simple fixed distance, right? But let's take this one step further. An experienced trader might take more risk early on in the trade and naturally become more protective if it's in a healthy profit. This is a behavioural trait known as loss aversion. They don't want to give up the gains that they've just made. We can recreate that behaviour here using this gate block. The gates can output one of two values based on a condition. If V is true, output A, otherwise output B. So let's combine this with everything we've learned so far in this video. I'm going to create a condition based on the last signal profit to see whether my trade's in more than 10% profit. If it is, then the strategy uses the ATR percentage as the stop distance. However, if the trade's in less than 10% profit, then I want a wider stop so it's got some room to breathe, and I'm going to use a multiple of the ATR. I can do this by adding a maths operation block, setting it to multiply, and feeding in the ATR percentage, as well as a fixed number block, and let's set this to say 2.5. Then I connect both stop distances into the gate block, and remember if there's different time frames to use a variable. So the gate block, depending on the last signal profit, decides on whether to output the wider stop distance or the smaller one. The end result is a trailing stop that's wide when the trade is young and tight when the trade is healthy. This is exactly how professional discretionary traders will think about their risk. So there's just a few useful examples. Now you've seen how to properly mix timeframes using variables. We've talked about OBV, cooldown periods with the order history block, how to create meaningful take profit and stop loss rules using the last signal profit block, and how to design flexible trailing stops that can adapt to volatility and profit levels. In the next video, we're going to talk about backtesting. This is where you simulate your strategy over historical market data, and we'll talk about how you can troubleshoot if your strategy isn't behaving as you expect. I'll see you there.